to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is Keith Miller, and I am your host today for this regular monthly series of discussions focused on an article or book review published in the ASA Journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today, our guest is Scott Waalkes. Scott is a professor of international politics and the director of general education at Malone University in Canton, Ohio. Welcome, Scott, to Diving Deeper.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Scott has written a book review for the ASA Journal on an interesting and, I believe, very relevant book. The book is authored by Jen Twenge and entitled Generations, the Real Differences Between Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and what they mean for America's future. If you haven't seen the book, this is what the book looks like. And Scott's review was actually one of the most downloaded articles on the ASA website, which is one of the reasons why we asked him to join us. So a little bit about Scott. Scott is a proud member of Generation X, is currently an advising dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia, where he originally earned his MA and PhD degrees in foreign affairs after earning a BA in political science from Calvin University. Prior to his arrival at UVA, he was professor of international politics, director of general education, and co-director of the Pendle Hill Initiative at Malone University, a Christian college in Canton, Ohio. He and his wife, Michelle, have 3 adult children. Shepherding these children into adulthood and working with college students for 30 years contributed to his interest in generational cohorts, and he is delighted to have this conversation with us today about this topic. Before we jump into the discussion, I want us to get to know Scott a little bit better. In his short bio, which I just read, he already talks about his some of his academic history. So what encouraged you to go into the particular field that you did, and what ultimately drew you to this particular book?
Well, thanks for the question, Keith, and thanks to Becky and the whole ASA team for this invitation. It's really a great opportunity just to chat a little bit. And I have to say, before I answer your question, I also just think, given my high school and college performance in science and math courses, I think my professors and teachers would probably laugh at the thought that I'm speaking with a group of folks from the American Scientific Affiliation. I know that not everyone's a scientist, but I am not a natural scientist. I am indeed a political scientist, and some people might say political science is not science. So that's just sort of a funny thought to me, of all places. But you never know. I think God has a sense of humor. So my interest in becoming a political scientist was a matter of vocation, I think, and a sense of calling. And that's a really important Christian doctrine, and really just a foundational piece of my understanding of what it means to follow Christ, is to understand that we're all called as humans. We're all called specifically to respond to God in general, but Christians are called to follow Jesus Christ. That calling came upon me, I think, in a very clear way when I was a junior at Calvin, my 3rd year. And I went from a deep sense of crisis and not knowing what to do, where to go next in my vocational journey, my life journey, to gaining a really pretty quick sense of clarity. And it was a pretty rapid sort of turnaround, and I would even say a conversion, despite having been raised in a Christian home. I just had this pivot, and I think God was all about that. And out of that came this sense, I think I could become a professor of political science. I think I would love to do that. Like, I actually was an undecided major in my 2nd year still. And finally at Calvin, they said, well, you're a sophomore. You have to declare a major now at the end of the sophomore year. I said, well, I don't know what to do. And the advisor said, well, you've taken some political science classes. You seem to have enjoyed them. Maybe try that. I'm like, okay, that's about as much thought as I gave to it. And a year later, I was passionate about the thought, oh my goodness, I could study international politics And it was actually because of an advisor who spoke to me, Professor Bob DeVries at Calvin, said, "Have you ever thought about going to graduate school in political science?" And I said, "No, I've not. I'd never thought of that. I didn't even really imagine that option. I didn't even know what that entailed." And so, um, really, he planted the seed, and it obviously sprouted. And I ended up having a 30-year career teaching international politics courses to primarily Christian college students, and it was incredibly rewarding. I did a little bit of writing and research, but heavily emphasizing teaching, and it was a deeply fulfilling role. And then just this last year, I've pivoted, and I think it's still a sort of part of the calling to work directly with students. And what I find so life-giving is doing that kind of advising work. So at critical moments in my journey, I had advisors who helped me with being undecided and then helped me imagine possibilities. So I feel like this last stage of my professional career, I'm able to kind of live out of that and I guess give back to students, even though it's in a large state university. Doesn't matter. It's still part of my calling. So, to answer your question, Keith, calling. I just had a strong sense of calling to become a political scientist. And then the specific question of this book, I think resonates with me as a parent, as a professor, and now as an advisor, working with young people, just trying to understand young people over the course of a long career. I have noticed changes and shifts, and just at a very intuitive level, there's something very, very plausible about this generational analysis. I see, you know, folks of my parents' generation, the silent generation, and I do see differences between them and those born just a couple of years later, who we would put in the baby boom generation. I'm a Generation Xer, born in 1968. I have a colleague who's a millennial, several millennial colleagues now in this role here. And I do think there are some intuitive differences. And even within my own family, and this is maybe where it really popped the most for me. We have three children. Our oldest was born in 1992. The second was born in 94, and the third was born in 1996. And according to Jean Twenge, and I think Jonathan Haidt, her colleague, in sort of similar vein of research, they would, I think, both say there's something about young people born about 1996 or later that marks them as different. And the theory is it's smartphones and social media really combined. And so Jean Twenge's previous book was called iGen, about just this generation. And it was really, really striking and plausible as I looked at my own children, because I do think there might even be some differences between the first two, who would technically be millennials, and the third, who by the strict application of the definition would be Gen Z. And some of the trends that Jean Twenge talks about seem to kind of apply in the way that they're slightly different. So there's a plausibility as a parent, and then of course as a professor and advisor of students. I'm just trying to figure out, who are these people I'm supposed to work with? Where did they come from? And also understanding my own generation and its own sort of gifts and also limitations. So long answer to that question, but thanks, Keith. Hope that answers
So
it.
how did you come to know or become aware of the ASA?
Actually, at Malone University, I have a colleague, had a colleague for many, many years, who was, I think, the book review editor for a while for the perspectives on Christian Science and Christian faith. And that was Lauren Seifert. And she reached out to faculty at Malone and said, "Hey, here's a list of books, so maybe someone could review. We were always looking for book reviews." And I had looked at the list that she had emailed, and I thought, nothing quite caught my eye. And I thought, oh, I just recently finished reading this book with a faculty reading group at Malone. And I found it to be a fascinating book for discussion. And as I say in the review, I have lots of post-it flags, if you can see here. Many, many post-it flags in my copy as I was reading and meeting weekly with our little summer book group, just raising lots of great questions and offering great discussion, to be thinking about generations. And so I pitched it to Lauren Seifert, and she said, "Sure, go for it." And I thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. I think I've heard of the ASA a little bit in passing, but that's my first real point of contact directly was through Lauren Seifert, who was the book review editor. And I'm so glad. I had no idea. I was kind of shocked when you said it's been one of the most downloaded articles. This is, I think, how God works sometimes. It's shocking. I just thought, I'll try this. We'll see what happens. And you reached out not too long ago, and I thought, hey, I mean, I'm game. If you all want me, thanks for the invite because I'll talk about this. First had to find the copy and remember what I wrote a couple of years ago, but thankfully it came back.
Well, we will focus our discussion on the explanations for generational differences are given by Twenge. And I think these should provide a lot of things for contemplation and discussion. But before we move to audience questions, I'd like to get Scott's response on a few conclusions that were drawn by Twenge. And hopefully this will provide some stimulus for our discussion, especially for those that haven't been able to actually read the book. Should help us get the discussion together. So one of those questions is, in fact, you state at the very beginning of your book review, you have a quotation. And I forget now who you were quoting, but the quotation is, thinking about comparison is unthinkable. Thinking without comparison is unthinkable. And in the absence of comparison, so is all scientific thought and scientific research. Could you explain or expand on that idea and why you use that as your lead-in?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a deliberate choice. As I read the book and then thought about the review and then thought it in a scientific context, I do think that Twenge is a social scientist and genuinely trying to make valid scientific conclusions. Large N survey data, large numbers of data sets, larger than her previous book, many more, I think 39 million total respondents. So she's trying to draw valid statistical conclusions out of these large scale surveys of people who are, nationally representative samples, randomized, scientifically sampled. And so in that sense, it's good social science, and it is comparative. And so I actually found the quote. It was not an author I have actually read, I'll be honest, but it was in a book. I taught comparative politics, and I was trained within comparative politics, one of the subfields in political science. And there's a lot of emphasis, and I was a qualitative scholar. And so within the qualitative field, there's a lot of discussion about how do you make careful comparisons. And so the quote was actually in a textbook I would use to teach comparative politics. And so, yeah, to think without comparison is unthinkable. And I thought so I stuck it in my brain. And so it sort of was lodged there when I was looking at the book. And I do think Twenge does do a lot of comparing to try to draw some valid conclusions. Mostly, though, over time, right, with longitudinal surveys. And now in this work, birth cohorts, certain birth, segments born certain years, and then comparing averages between those groups, the folks born, between these years, sampled against folks born between these years. Do you see differences in their responses on these survey questions? That's basically her fundamental kind of go-to method throughout her career. And she's really good at it, and she has a lot of charts. And one thing that's lovely about the book is there's so many charts. And I think her colleague, Jonathan Haidt, a fellow psychologist, also does the same thing in his most recent book, The Anxious Generation, which I would also highly recommend. Same kind of thing. He's got these lovely charts, and they're just nice encapsulated visuals, and they're always over time. They always show, over time, and just a simple sort of line graph that goes up or down depending on the question. And so it's easy to kind of capture those differences and to visualize them. And I appreciate that. Maybe it's just because I'm a visual thinker. So the point, I think, of using the quote about comparisons being a basis for science, I mean, I think it's mostly true that we can only draw valid conclusions if we can compare something to something else, even when we're using numbers, or perhaps especially when we're using numbers, quantitative or qualitative. To be able to make a valid conclusion, we've got to say, compared to this other thing, this looks significant. And we can even run some tests in the case of statistics to test for significance. Now, she's not doing that in this book. She does do it in her, peer-reviewed, I think, published research. But for a broad, New York-based publisher, I don't think she's getting into that level of testing for significance between these differences, which would be one of my critiques. So the comparison point is she's doing this, she's doing science, but she's also not, doing all the science she could do. What she's not done in comparison is cross-national comparisons. So all the
Mhm.
survey, 39 million surveys, all of the United States citizens. So we don't, if she's trying to make a case that technology drives generational differences, uh, she's got a case study of one, only the
Mhm.
United States. So she's doing excellent longitudinal comparison over time in terms of birth cohorts. But what about citizens of other places, or residents of other places? There's no cross-spatial comparison, and so I'm not really ready to be convinced of her thesis about technology. And yet, I think she's advancing the discussion by making these longitudinal comparisons. So that was kind of the idea. It was both an affirmation of the work, but also a nod or a nudge to say, if this is going to be a vein of research in the future, they're going to be needing, she and her team and others will have to be looking outside the United States for other data.
One of the other things that and you mentioned it in passing, um, she emphasizes that the generational differences that she describes are averages. And she wants to
Mhm.
emphasize the fact that these are averages. Why is that important?
Well, I have a good friend who taught introductory statistics for so many years with students, and we would talk a lot about statistics. And thank goodness, because again, my professor at Calvin who taught me statistics would be horrified. And I did take research methods in graduate school, and I dusted those off later, and I actually brushed up again on my statistics. But I had this colleague who would always say, average, a mean or a median is an average of central tendency, right, for a large group. The fact is we also need measures of dispersion, right? The standard deviation. So it's measuring where, on average for the group, the central tendency. But if we have huge standard deviations or significant outliers, then we need to be careful. It may not be a normal bell-shaped curve, a normal distribution. We could have these two outliers, way out on the edges, and then the average makes it look like, oh, there's this really nice median or mean to this group, and it could be covering up a lot of variation. And so I think that would be my fundamental thought, is a sort of a statistical point. And again, I feel like I'm walking on thin ice. That's not my area. I was a qualitative researcher, but I do think that's the main problem um, with using averages and using survey data averages. You're
Okay,
potentially covering up that variation or those outliers.
so Becky, why don't you go ahead and open things up? Um, and I know that Del Kuhn sent in actually a couple questions.
Mhm.
Um, so, Del, do you want to give maybe just pick part of it? You had rather a long kind of series of nested questions, but
Okay,
to throw off to Scott.
okay. I'm gonna maybe go to what I think is a part of my question. I agree with you on, I agree with you about the book and what you said, and I'll add that I think it's a really valuable reference to have. And even if you're not a reader, I think she presents her material very, very well in graphical form. And I'm going to agree that the data shows something happened around 2012. But where I think needs to be augmented is technology is too facile an explanation, even smartphones, especially with her broad definition of technology. So if you were going to augment her data, what would you like to see her add, not just longitudinal to other countries that surveys, but I'm thinking more in terms of the internal. What makes up a person? What are they exposed to? What is their family situation like? What do they learn in school? Is it 1776? Is it 1619? What's on television? Is it Father Knows Best, All in the Family, or The Sopranos? What's their relationship to their society? Were their grandparents or grandparents in the military? If so, what era? World War II, Vietnam, Gulf War, all different. So basic question is,
Mm.
Let's get away from technology as a little bit too facile and say, what would you think would augment her data about understanding what we all know is the intuitive difference between one generation and another?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question, Del. Thanks. I absolutely agree. I have that in my notes here that the technology is way too broad of an explanation and that it can cover. So here are the technologies. She says these are just examples, but she says television, kind of in order chronologically when they were introduced: television, home appliances, air conditioning, birth control, computers, internet news, and social media. And actually in that list is, she doesn't put smartphones, but Jonathan Haidt would, and I think in her prior book, iGen, she would have said smartphones are really essential. It's smartphones plus social media. When you look at Jonathan Haidt's work, is the essential piece, and he really focuses in on that. But I absolutely agree with your point. In fact, I was jotting down the thought, other variables here. What are some other factors? And you mentioned things like family, parenting style, home environment, the schooling, these sort of micro level differences. She makes a claim early in the book on page 2. She says, in fact, when you were born has a larger effect on your personality and attitudes than the family who raised you does. That is, that the year you were born has a larger effect on your personality than the family that raised you. I'm like, that seems to be overstating the point. Like you say, Del, I am not ready to throw family out in that. And I think Jonathan Haidt in his work is nuancing this and talking about, the culture as well of safetyism, as he calls it. And partly that's how families and parenting, the kind of coddling of children and by parents contributes to some of the outcomes that we're seeing. So yeah, that would be, one of the most fundamental. And also I would add, we would want to see, not just large number quantitative data sets, but we would want to see, individual interviews and micro level discussions in sociology or psychology, where we have, we flesh these things out, because large scale quantitative data, you can do a lot of things and make the numbers say things you want them to say. But are you, when you're talking to people, are they at the ground level, children, young adults, are they actually articulating these differences in their own words? Are you seeing it? So I'd want to see a micro level explanation with lots of case studies and interviews with people. And perhaps it would be I'm sure it will be a lot messier. It won't be as simple. And you'll see those other omitted variables that you're talking about. Technology is just so broad. And so, I'm skeptical of the theory and the proof that or the evidence she's trying to offer. Even while I agree with you, we see those differences. I would also add one other thought. There's another technology she doesn't list that I think has been very influential on our society, and that is the automobile, the internal combustion engine. And I don't think that she talks at all about those differences, which happened much earlier in the 20th century. Those differences also came to roost after World War II, but you could already see the effects of people relying on automobiles instead of transit for their transportation, beginning with 1920s already, and certainly post World War II, and that's had a huge impact. And what about loneliness? We talk here about a loneliness epidemic. I think some of that isolation isn't just smartphones; it's the way neighborhoods are designed and the fact that people ride in cars, they don't walk. There's so many other social variables. It's to use the jargon, it's overdetermined, this outcome. These generational differences are overdetermined. There's so many factors. And to just grab technology and say, yeah, technology explains it. It is a very facile explanation. I do agree.
If anyone has questions, please use your raise the hand. And if you do, we'll call on you. Seeing none right now.
I think there is a hand up.
Oh, there's one up? Oh,
yeah.
John, go ahead.
Bob Driver Bishop was up, I think, first, or maybe. I don't know.
I appreciate that.
Okay, I didn't see it. Sorry.
I appreciate the study and what I've been able to hear. In the original Strauss and Howe, though, it said that these cycles are in 20 and 80 year, which we know is adjustable. But also I point out the intriguing thing that every 500 years we go through a cycle. And Phyllis Tickle picked up on this in her writing that she particularly focused on the church, that the church in essence has to completely change. And we're going back to the time of the Reformation 500 years ago, which was a time of major technological change. And I guess the question that abides with me is, are we as faithful scientists really in parallel with those early reformers who, in the midst of significant technological change, were helping to show people where the grounding or the important messages were? Because I find in these groups, particularly the winter gathering, quite profound that this is a place that can help direct the faith community as they run away from churches, but they're searching for an answer that they can really put their teeth into it, that's lasting, that has substance. And that's essentially the work that we're about. I'm rambling now, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm talking about.
No, I do, and I like that question a lot because I think it also raises another limitation of the book. She's focused extremely heavily on, post World War II history and really things happening in the 2000s and beyond. And that 500-year perspective or 1,000-year or millennial perspective, in the literal sense of millennial, the history of the church, the history of the world. It could just be we're living through, a significant transformation, although it might be too soon to tell. We don't know. We're in the middle of it, but I like your way of framing it, Bob, where you say, there were the reformers who tried to be faithful in that moment. And so those new technologies of the printing press allowed, the distribution of the Bible. Literacy rates skyrocketed in these countries where they were printing Bibles, teaching people to read the Bible and to understand it, distributing those Bibles in an accessible form, a widespread literacy. And it does feel like we're shifting away from that. And it has been about 500 years. So it is really an interesting time. Information and communication technology has fundamentally shifted away from print-based communication, at least for those who are in the educated sphere. There's always been an oral culture, where people can communicate, but the sort of dominance of print-based media clearly is gone. And instead we've got, whatever we have now, I guess TikTok. I don't know. Now I sound like an old man from Generation X, not understanding those youth these days. But there's an opportunity there, and there's a space for Christians to continue to be faithful. And here you all are. Here we are using YouTube, which does seem to be a medium that a lot of those millennials and Gen Zers and Polars or whatever do use. And so it's a good example. I think you're right. The calling is always the same: to be faithful and to respond to the summons, to speak the truth and to witness to the truth of who God is and what God has done in this world. And whatever our context, that's the call. It doesn't change. And so we might just be living through this. And this book helps us, I think, to begin to discern the spirit of the age a little bit. And perhaps it is a 500-year epical shift that's happening. Nonetheless, we're still called to be faithful and figure out these digital natives and these TikTokers, and maybe we should just bemoan all of this and say, woe is us. But I don't think that's the answer. I think we just need to re-engage. So great thought. Great question.
John?
Thanks, Scott. This is really fascinating conversation. I'm thinking about scale and in this, and you've touched on it, Bob. Your question gets at it, right? As you go out in time, so you can have time as a scalar, right? So these generational blocks, but you can also have population. And now I want to think about human behavior a little bit. I spend my time with animal behavior, so but there's a lot of similarities in some ways. But anyway, I'm just thinking about the boomer generation in particular. I mean, look at the demographics and what happens. So I just want to think with you about that, because there seem to be these larger trends, and then there's smaller sort of within group things that happen sort of geographically, as you talked about. She's talking the United States. And I think sometimes we construct these unitary concepts. We say, oh yeah, they're boomers. I say, wait a minute, they're boomers and boomers. There's like they're not all the same, but there are these broad sweeping things that we share, just human. And I'm wondering if some of what we're seeing is maybe not so much technology driven or other, is just human behavior driven. Is we copy one another really quickly. We're good at that. And it seems as we move along, and I'm no sociologist, so I don't know if this applies, but it seems to me that a lot of what we're seeing is just group behavior, is we're all looking around at us and who looks like us. And that starts happening in particular with teenagers. You go through that formative period. Does this ring a bell with you?
Yes, definitely. And I'm not a sociologist, and I haven't done a lot of the work, but there is a lot of discussion about the mimetic theory. Humans imitate each other, mimesis, imitation of each other. There's kind of at the level of sociology, literary theory, a very famous theorist, Rene Girard, who talks about the mimetic theory of desire, and it's a theory to understand scapegoating. And so in-group, out-group dynamics, yes, it's a powerful kind of social learning that happens. Humans observe and copy. We know this happens a lot. Consumer behavior, absolutely. Economics would also touch on this. No question about it. How something becomes popular and there's imitation and you follow. The thing I notice, the other side of it that you're talking about, those within group differences, I'm struck by the problem now of polarization. And I think she talks about generation polar, and maybe that's part of the reason she likes that term. She also thinks it evokes issues with climate change for this youngest generation, born more recently. And I do think the polarization issue is one we're seeing within the country, within the society, significant differences, and it does tend to break down pretty much between rural and urban lines. So that's something I've been thinking about now, and just working on some place-based work for a course I'm going to teach here at UVA about place, I think next year. And I'm also not a geographer. I know Janelle Curry-Roper is on the call and part of ASA. I'm not, formally trained, but I absolutely think geography is a discipline that's been underappreciated. So that factor, the geographics that you touch on, within group variations between different places and regions. And I would love to see, do these generational differences really hold the same in urban, folks versus rural folks of these generations? I bet you that's going to be what we'd call a cross-cutting variable that's going to create significant differences. And so she says, for example, millennials are less religious. Well, that's on average, but I think millennials in more rural areas are probably just as religious as ever, or more religious. And meanwhile, the ones who are living in urban areas generally and also educated, that's the other big cleavage, to use the social science term, is education levels. So those with a bachelor's degree or above are more likely to probably live in a city and be different. They're going to be secular. They're going to be not very religious. And folks who, have slightly lower education levels and live in small towns and rural areas are just as religious as they've ever been. And, that generational analysis then doesn't hold. So yeah, it's another one of those variables that is omitted in her model, and I think worth thinking about. So I think we have another hand up. Maybe we should keep going. Mark Strand?
Yes. Hi, Scott. Thank you for your time with us. You feel like an ASAer, so I hope you're being motivated to become active and involved in the Real welcome. Yeah. Gordon College, July of this year. Yeah, come and join us. My question would be, with the current, say, the Gen Z, or let's just say people between like 20 and 35 currently, whom I work with in the university setting, let's think about the good change and then some of the challenges. So, my children are all in their late 20s. they are far more open than I was. They're far more inclusive in spirit. They're more global in their understanding, less absolute. And this has been a blessing to my wife and I as they have expanded our capacity for grace. So we acknowledge some of the generational changes bring with it, value or behavioral or other types of changes. So if you could, either channeling the author of this book, which I have not read, or even your own thoughts, comment on what are the good things, and then where do we need to be willing to speak prophetically and courageously to the current generation of young persons who are coming of age? Thank you.
That's a great question. Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, it is something in my work as a professor for so many years, and now working just one-on-one, mostly advising students on a daily basis. The things I'm seeing and noticing, I think you're exactly right. That my own 3 children, also in the millennial, 2 millennials and 1 Gen Zer, I guess, by the definitions. I've noticed that same thing. Yeah, all the positives. There is a lot of inclusive,ness and openness and curiosity and awareness. And I just, having grown up with the internet most of or all of their lives, they know how to research. They're quick. They're thoughtful. And I think that the other side that Jonathan Haidt in particular really emphasizes is the mental health crisis and anxiety and depression. Absolutely the scourge of this generation, these 2 young generations, perhaps even more for Gen Z, actually. And that's the argument. Those born 1996 or later, statistically much more likely to be diagnosed, not just to say they feel depressed, but to objectively be diagnosed or even hospitalized, suicide rates, et cetera. Objective measures, right? Hard measures, not just attitudinal shifts, but actual behavioral shifts that we can see. And I see it on a daily basis at the University of Virginia, and I saw it in my work at Malone University for those years too. Students in crisis, students with real challenges and real anxiety, and then maybe connected to parenting as well. I think it is at the micro level. I think often children who have not just what we used to talk about, the helicopter parents, but now then I've heard about the bulldozer parents, and there's maybe even another metaphor, parents who do so much for their children to keep things safe and to help them advance, that the kids don't learn their own sustainability, their own sort of habits of mind and discipline. And so we see a lot of that, I think, in this generation. So that's the downside of, and partly too, COVID. That's a whole other thing, which I think Twenge does touch on. But in the COVID period, there at a critical moment in these young people's development, they were sent home. I actually have a small little micro theory. I think the ones who were in the 8th grade, so I believe that's this year's 3rd year junior college students, juniors. The ones who went home in March of their 8th grade year had to go home and spend a lot more time with their families. I think they're actually maybe better off, and they may be unusually brilliant. So there's that, talk about a positive side, and I've observed a couple of cases of this. It's kind of a hunch. Feel free to publish on it. I'm not going to ever probably do that research. I'm not a sociologist, but kids born whatever year that was that ended up going home in the 8th grade year for COVID might be unusually great leaders someday in an incredible class. I just have this hunch. So like these things are complex.
I think Twenge actually briefly mentions that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's another side of COVID.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look. Maybe I got the seed of the idea from her and then observed it in particular individual students I was working with. But I've worked with a few students around that era, and it's not a hard and fast distinction. 7th, 8th, the kids in middle school, I think maybe had less negative effects and maybe even had more positive effects. But it's always a mixed bag, right? And what I appreciate about Twenge is she's not doom and gloom, and she's a little more positive, I think, than Jonathan Haidt, who is more despairing of this anxious generation and the parenting that's leading to epidemics of anxiety and depression. So I like the spirit of the question that there's going to be pluses and negatives, and we want to affirm the good and help them work against the limitations and the bad.
Bob, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. One, I appreciate, Scott, all that you're doing and who you are. I spent many years as a university chaplain at a state university. And my wife's a UVA graduate. Hometown.
Wahoo, as they say down here.
Yeah. Um, I'd like to expand a little bit. Professor Eric Klein, University of Maryland, and also I now believe American University, wrote 1789 BC, but he's got a Netflix video on for those available. And he points out that we go through these global crises every 1600 years, warming crises. And there were the proverbial Dark Ages, and before that were the Greek Dark Ages. And actually, one of the hallmarks of that time was the Trojan War. It wasn't over a beautiful woman, it was lack of resources. And Professor Klein does a wonderful, very academic treatment of this. I heard him at the Oriental Institute of Chicago, where I had done studies originally. The point is, and I just wonder, this is going beyond the 500, is with the advent of global warming, if this cycle is continuing, like animals get very nervous when things are going to happen. I wonder if that's adding anxiety to our culture, an acceleration of anxiety for the youth of today. And I don't have an answer with this, but I do know we learned from the past. And 1600 years ago, the two people who made the most significant difference for Christianity were St. Patrick and his good buddy, St. Basil of Anatolia. In fact, the two had connectivity with theology and making systemic changes that helped the church at their time. And hopefully you are the third incarnation for this generation. But I just want to put it out there, how this resonates with you.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. There are cyclical theories of history, very popular cyclical theories popular within the my field of international relations that I was trained in. All different sort of time frames. That it is interesting when we have a series of changes all overlapping around the same time. They do seem to kind of coalesce. And even folks in political science were talking about Stephen Jay Gould's idea of punctuated equilibrium for a while as a metaphor, which is his partly, I guess, Gould's sort of theory of how evolution works. And ASA folks, I'm sure that's a sweet spot for you, not for me. But yeah, the idea of a cyclical analysis, and it's possibly the case that it could be climate change. I will say we're experiencing rapid political change at the international level. The international order that was established after World War II is shifting. And that's a factual statement. I've been saying this, it's not that's not a partisan statement. That's just a descriptive statement. The United States, at the end of World War II, built an international system with free international trade, or not completely free, but stable international trade. The United States military with 100 and some bases around the world, patrolling the seas, promoting lower tariffs, freer trade. That whole system, they call it the post-war international order, or the liberal international system, is clearly shifting and has been for a while for many reasons. And so just to make the point, there is a lot of rapid change happening in the political realm, which I'm most familiar with. So I'm intrigued. I'll have to check out this analysis. I like the idea of thinking about this in a larger historical perspective. Again, not just 500 years, but 1600 years. And behind that, at some level, in the mysteries of history, maybe there's some sort of role for the spirit. Historians are very skeptical of what they call the providential view of history, or the Whiggish view of history, that somehow God is always evolving, leading, the process. So historians are very critical and skeptical of that. I think rightly so. We have to be very humble about making these generalizations. However, I think we should be very attuned.
Yeah, I have been working with ancient Mesopotamian scholars, and we can trace this even 1600 years before, and that actually gave rise to Abraham. Because what happens at each of these junctures, to pick up on what you're saying, Scott, is a rise in authoritarian governments because of the climate crises. They kind of fear throws out rational thought.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
people submit themselves to Sargon the Great, or the whole Trojan War, was an exercise in male superiority, and that really turned out well. And then, the Dark Ages, or the collapse of empires. I just wonder if we can learn from that. I'm sorry I drone on, but I do appreciate you being here.
Well, thanks. No, it's a really interesting question. I think I have another hand up. I would also say, as you say that, I mentioned the kind of erosion of the post World War II international system. The other thing is there has been a rise of populism and authoritarianism. Political scientists, were saying there had been a kind of a hallmark, a sort of high point of democracies around the world after the end of the Cold War. And now they're saying, no, there's been an erosion, a backsliding, fewer democracies, more folks around the world, subverting democracy. And so that's also just to the point, there's significant and more authoritarian regimes that's currently the trend. Now, again, maybe, in 50 years, everyone will say, no, those guys were all wrong. They thought they knew what was happening. And I'm always humble about history. I've learned that from history, but it's also something to be paying attention to. So I think Ron Hodges has had a hand up for a while there. Sorry about that.
Go ahead and unmute.
I'm unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. Generations can change as they get older. And so I'm wondering if there's any way to decouple that from an analysis of the various generations. If you're comparing a 20-year-old from Generation Z to a 70-year-old from Boomers, how do people can become more religious as they get older. So how can does she make any attempt to decouple that?
She does, actually. She spends some time talking about the differences between, changes in attitude within groups, generational cohorts, just a little bit of that. And I think, it does suggest as a generation ages, there will be some shifts. But it is a really good question. It reminds me of there's the famous quote Winston Churchill said, if you're not a socialist or a liberal when you're 20, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not a conservative by the time you're 50, there's something wrong with you, or something along those lines. I do think life experience, wisdom, for most humans causes them to change their views and become aware, and hopefully modify their views in response, hopefully, to the environment. Not everybody, clearly. But we're talking about averages, right, Keith? We're talking about averages, not every single person. So that helped, Ron. Thanks for that. It's a good question. I encourage you to read the book, I guess, is what I would say on
that. This is a little bit different question. Looking at kind of repeated patterns between the generations. And one of the things that, in that regard, that stood out to me is awareness of discrimination and protests related to civil rights and so forth. Seem to go through these cyclical patterns. I put down that, despite the end of segregation, the economic divide between blacks and whites, if anything, continued to increase. In the 1990s, there was Rodney King and O.J. Simpson. And then for millennials, then you had Trayvon Martin and George Floyd murders. And it seems like every generation had to rediscover the reality of racial prejudice. Something would happen, there'd be a big response, and then a generation later, it had to happen all over again. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the most interesting things in the book is that what struck me, perhaps almost one of the top interesting insights. Many of the leaders of the social protest movements that we associate with the 60s are actually from the silent generation. That was a very interesting insight. And actually, baby boomers on average are actually more conservative. So that was fascinating to me to think about. And yeah, I tended to think, oh, those baby boomers after World War II, they would all grow up and they would all be protesting against the Vietnam War. But the leadership were from the silent generation. And that was a really interesting insight. So, and I do think it tends to kind of bounce back and forth. So the silent generation are very progressive. You think Bob Dylan and many of these other kind of leaders of that, Martin Luther King Jr., et cetera. I mean, they're from that era, and they're the leaders. So the followers, some were baby boomers, and some of those baby boomers later became conservatives. And so then you have Gen X, which is sort of, I don't know, politically indifferent, I think, maybe a little bit cynical, alienated. We sort of we had to live through the 70s, that was not a good time for us, stagflation and gas lines and, oil embargoes and all that stuff, inflation, etc. And then, yeah, these millennials though are often more social justice minded, and so it seems like each generation has its own political awakening, but these younger generations, the Gen Z, millennials, both of them are politically, socially very aware, very progressive, often on average, and very engaged. It seems, well, actually, I suppose maybe not just progressive. Again, back to the polarization, you're seeing, Charlie Kirk fans, after his assassination, especially young men. Actually, that's the gender differences. Young men seem to really resonate with some of the kind of masculinity and these other images, and what that seem to be represented by someone like Charlie Kirk, religiosity, being a man of character, a man of faith, and all this, and that's sort of interesting too. So there's kind of generally a more politically engaged, I think, generation, the younger one. My own generation is a little less engaged. She also makes the point that Gen X, at one point, there were no national leaders in elected offices that were even from Gen X. It was all baby boomers and then millennials. I think Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has broken that rule finally. One of the only national political leaders who's technically in Gen X. J.D. Vance is actually a millennial. So it's a fascinating insight about who gets to be a political leader, who is a politically engaged generation. It's kind of nuanced. That's a fun theme, I think, throughout the book.
I guess just as a follow-up, that I guess my question or is why when there's a social movement, a movement against prejudice or racial prejudice or desegregation and so forth, doesn't seem to be able to be sustained. It's not like the society comes to revelation, makes a move in a certain direction, and a generation later, it's like that never even existed. Why can't those movements be sustained beyond a generation or two?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think political inertia, institutional inertia, power, it tends to, the famous quote, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power, absolutely. I do think there's an overall kind of devolution of power, devolution of institutions, and every generation has to kind of wake back up and try to reform. And I would even say, from a theological perspective, in a broken and fallen world, those tendencies are quite powerful, and they are going to be repetitive. And that's sort of a general sort of slide away from justice, and every generation needs to kind of reorient the political system and political institutions to seek first justice, seek first the kingdom, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That sort of has to be rediscovered, I think, over and over in this world. That's sort of my sense of that, how to answer that question. But I hope that helps. Looks like 2 more hands up at least, so make sure we can get to everybody here.
Yeah, go ahead. Mark, why don't you go first?
I was just going to respond. I think that's very insightful, Keith. But I would say that we actually do see change. But what we see is with each generation, there's like a course correction, or you might say a reaction against it. So I think with regard to some of the current social wars issues that the current administration is, winning some support from, honestly, I think that's going to be a blip in our social, trajectory. And I think it's partially a function of the degree to which we have been able to improve, just racial equality, social justice, the rights of women, the roles of women. So I would tend to think we do see progress, but it has to be relearned, yes. And it's always going to meet with a new challenge in each generation because of that brokenness that we face. So I just throw that out there for consideration. Thank you.
Thanks.
John?
Scott, this is fascinating. I want to take you back to where you started, and that's the nature of data in the social sciences and natural. I mean, this is our challenge, all of us, right? Trying to detect a signal that's a real signal against the noise in the background. And especially as we were just talking a minute or two ago there about these various trans leaders from from a previous generation of this generation, I think, well, that's interesting. But I'd like to see data on that, because one of the things that I've experienced over the years is we fall into this. We're really good at pattern recognition. I'm a strategic thinker. I see 3 dots, I draw a line, and it's a straight line. But in fact, you could draw circles through that same set of 3 dots. You could draw a kind of infinite number of patterns. And so there's always this challenge of seeing pattern where there isn't anything actually there. It's not cause and effect. And I sense that, especially today with our communication capacity, people are drawing conclusions continuously, rapidly. And we have, as we've talked about, Bob brought it up, looking at these long-term 500-year cycles and all of these. So I want to come back to your cautionary statement. If you have any thoughts about that in terms of reading a book like this, and then, where it is a popularization of the technical side. And that's a challenge for an organization like ourselves when we try and stand between what the natural and social scientists are doing and then what's actually happening theologically, and then how do we comment on that? Could you want to?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah, I do like the idea that we should be cautious, and it's easy to grab a book and run with the ideas. And we hear an idea from a book or a podcast, or we see a YouTube video, we grab it, and you're like, oh, this explains everything. And we have to be really careful. Sometimes it obscures as well, like a magnifying glass or a binoculars or telescope. You can focus in on one thing, but your peripheral boundaries of that field of vision are fuzzy, and you may be missing things outside. So that's sort of the image that comes to mind. If we focus solely on this generational analysis and make that the focus, we could be losing these other dynamics that are at play, including, I think, like the racial justice concerns that Keith is talking about, or gender dynamics and workplace dynamics, and differences between rural and urban people. We have to just, hold on a little bit loosely to our theories, because it's always a simplification, right? As soon as you create a model, it's going to simplify reality. Reality will always be messy and complex. There will be patterns, and we can pay attention to those. But we always, I think, have to be humble, open, receptive to things that will contradict our framework. That's what I do appreciate about the natural sciences, is that idea of that humility, epistemic humility. I can't know, and I'm going to be careful about making a claim, and it's not proof, but it's evidence that we can falsify and challenge some ideas and bring support for other ideas. And it's never 100% proven. It's open-ended, and we're still ongoing and evaluating. That sort of demeanor, that approach toward the world, I think, is a really attractive one. And I think it's part of being humble, which aligns with our faith, right? That epistemic humility is part of walking humbly with our God.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have one other question here that I saved because I thought it would be a good and maybe an end point and a jumping off point. And that's in your review, you state that the last chapter in Twenge's book attempts to predict future trends. And you argue that you said that seems a bit forced and that the future may surprise us. Does that perhaps suggest that our joint future as a society may be more open-ended and undetermined than maybe the book suggests?
Yes, I would say yes. That's exactly, I think, exactly right. I was taking notes as we were getting ready for today's discussion, and I was thinking it is too deterministic. That one of my concerns about saying technology so broadly defined, it's just such a facile explanation, as I think Dell said, it breeds a certain passivity in us. Then, oh well, that's just because of smartphones and social media, so that's just this generation. And if that kind of passivity, oh, it's just going to determine that the generation is this way, they're going to be this way, so they will determine the future, and they are this way, so we already kind of know. But what I see, I like this idea. Actually, to some extent, there is a role for human agency, right? I mean, clearly, as a person raised in the Dutch Calvinist tradition, God's sovereignty, God's providence and control, it's like a fundamental doctrine in the Reformed understanding, which is beautiful. But there's sometimes then this sort of passivity. Well, God's in control. All things happen, for a reason. I hear that a lot. Things happen, everything happens for a reason is like the secularized, popularized version of that. Well, we just have to be, it's passive about it. But I think, no, we also are called to be faithful, and we have agency, including in the shaping of our society. And that's something that I do think is part of the call for Christians in the sciences, Christians in the social sciences, Christians in any sphere, is to practice what James Hunter calls faithful presence, right? To be present in the spheres where we are, to try to live out our faith with integrity, whatever sphere we're in, even at a state university, live it out faithfully and maintain the presence. Don't abandon the sector and give up on it. Be present, be faithful. We will inevitably make mistakes. We'll make moral compromises. We'll be wrong about history. We'll be on the wrong side, maybe, and not promoting justice. But if hopefully we maintain that faithful presence, then society hopefully will have an influence that is at least salt and light, right? That kind of pointing people to the light, to the truth, a preservative, the saltiness of that body, another metaphor Jesus uses, right? The parable of the yeast in the dough, right? Hidden, working. The parable of the mustard seed, the tiny little, group of kingdom followers that they're there like the yeast, or they're planted all over like these little mustard seeds all over society, and they're bearing their fruit. It's not seen. It's a hidden life. It's not seen by many, but it's still a life of faithfulness. And somehow, and then God's sovereignty, maybe, not that we're making history turn out the way we want it to, or making it all better and perfecting this world so that it'll be perfect, and then God can return, but being faithful, not knowing the end. I think that's the posture. So, faithful presence to shape our society as best we can, at least witness to the truth.
Well, thanks, Scott. I think that's a very good way to end our discussion, and I'm sure we can all continue mulling over some of these issues and thinking about our own calling in that context. So, just some announcements before we sign off. Next month, we are pleased to have Hans Matame and Joel Cho discussing their article, Every Square Inch, A Brief Theology of Medicine. And that's from the December 2025 issue of Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And then in April, the following month, we have confirmed Kerry Johnson, who will be discussing his article, Chemistry at War, also from the December issue of Perspectives. So once again, thank you, Scott, for sharing with us. And everyone, be sure to join us again in In March, this is February. And maybe bring some other colleagues or friends along. So from all of us at the ASA and Diving Deeper Discussions, may God richly bless you all.